The dust of the training yard had not settled since dawn, and already 3 men lay groaning in it. "Next," Lash Grimtusk said, and did not bother to raise her voice, because she did not need to. The word rolled out over the packed earth of Fort Aldermore's yard like a stone dropped into still water, and the ring of soldiers pressed back a half step, as if the ground itself had shifted beneath her boots. She stood in the center of the yard with her curved blade sheathed at her hip, unused, her knuckles wrapped in strips of leather, dark green skin gleaming with sweat under the mountain sun. Her leathers were oxblood dark, a fitted cuirass laced tight up the front, cinched at a waist that curved into powerful hips, sleeveless so that the ridged muscle of her arms caught the light with every breath. A single braid of black hair, threaded with small bone beads, fell over one shoulder. Her tusks were small, neat, gleaming white against lips set in a smile that held no mercy, and if anyone had looked closely enough, no cruelty either, only hunger, the hunger of a warrior who had not yet found anyone worth losing to. Sergeant Boren Fitch lay on his back a few feet from her, blinking up at the sky, one hand pressed to his ribs. "That is 8, said Captain Reeve Dunmore, from where he stood at the edge of the yard with his arms folded, and a look on his face that was equal parts fury and grudging awe. 8 men of my garrison, Grimtusk, and you have not drawn that blade once. I would not waste an edge on men who fall over so easily, Lash said. Send another, or admit there is not a man in this fort worth the trouble of my fist. The crowd soldiers off duty, a few monks from the old abbey halls who had wandered out at the noise, merchants who had stopped their carts on the road below to watch the spectacle through the open gate muttered and shifted. There was fear in some of the faces. Fort Aldermore sat high on the mountainside above the Ashkill coast, its walls built from the bones of an old monastery, and it had not seen an orc walk through its gates in peace since the treaty was signed 11 years before. Some of the older soldiers remembered the war. Some of them had lost brothers to blades not so different from the one at her hip. But there was something else in the crowd too, something none of them would have admitted aloud. A kind of breathless, helpless fascination. She was terrifying. She was also undeniably magnificent, and both of those things sat together in her without contradiction, the way a mountain storm is beautiful precisely because it could kill you. There is no shame in refusing, Dunmore said carefully. You have made your point. My men are not sport for an orc's amusement. I did not come to amuse myself, Lash said, and for a moment something harder than mockery flickered behind her amber eyes. I came because I need to know if there is a single man behind these walls worth trusting with what I have to say. So far you have shown me 8 who could not trust themselves to stay on their feet. That was when Luke Walker came through the gate, leading a mule loaded with 2 casks of whale oil, utterly unaware that he was about to become the answer to her question. He had walked up from the lighthouse at first light, as he did twice a month, to trade oil for flour and salted fish and news of ships, and he had not expected to find half the garrison gathered in the yard around an orc woman who had apparently just finished putting Sergeant Fitch on his back. Luke was not a large man. He had the lean, weathered build of someone who spent his days climbing narrow iron stairs and hauling oil drums up a cliff face, sun-browned skin, sandy hair kept short and practical, a quiet face that had learned patience the way other men learned swordplay out of necessity, alone, with no one watching. He kept to himself at the lighthouse on the headland below the fort, and the folk of Aldermore had long ago decided he was a strange, solitary sort of man, decent enough but not quite one of them. Walker! Someone called out, laughing. It was Fitch, hauling himself up off the ground with his ribs clearly aching, eager for someone else to feel the sting of failure beside him. Here's your chance to be a hero. Go on then. The lighthouse man wants a turn. Luke had not, in fact, said any such thing. But 24 faces turned toward him at once, and there was a particular cruelty in the way laughter spread through a crowd looking for anyone but themselves to shove forward. Someone took the mule's lead rope from his hand. Someone else clapped him on the shoulder and steered him toward the ring of trampled dust. Lash turned to look at him, and something in her expression sharpened with interest, the way a hunter's does when smaller prey turns out to have teeth. "This is your champion?" she asked Dunmore, though her eyes stayed on Luke. "He is no one's champion," Dunmore said, looking pained. "He tends the light on the headland. He is not a soldier, Grimtusk. There is no honor in—" "I did not ask for honor," Lash said. "I asked for a man willing to stand up." She looked Luke over, unhurried, from his worn boots to his oil-stained coat to his tired, steady eyes, and something in her voice softened by the barest fraction, though she would have denied it if asked. "Well, are you willing to stand up, lighthouse man?" Luke looked around at the crowd, at Fitch's smirking face, at the captain's obvious discomfort, and then at her, really looked at her, past the size of her, past the reputation that had clearly gone before her through the yard like a storm front. He saw a woman standing very straight in the center of a crowd that feared her, with no one beside her. "I suppose I am," he said. "Though I will tell you now, I have never won a fight in my life, and I do not intend to start today." A ripple of laughter went through the crowd, but Lash did not laugh. She tilted her head, studying him, and there was the faintest crease of a frown between her brows, as if he had said something she had not expected and did not yet know what to make of. "Then why stand up at all?" she asked. "Because somebody ought to," Luke said simply, "and it seems nobody else was going to." That was the first time he made her feel something she had no name for. She came at him fast, of course she did. She came at every man fast, testing them, seeing what they were made of in the first half-second before instinct took over. Luke did not raise his fists the way the soldiers had. He did not plant his feet and brace for a blow the way a man half her weight and a third her strength has any business bracing. He simply stepped aside, off balance, arms half raised, and when her open palm caught him across the shoulder, a blow she could have made twice as hard, and everyone in that yard knew it, he staggered, spun, and landed hard on his back in the dust. The crowd groaned, some in disappointment, some in the ugly satisfaction of watching someone fail exactly as expected. Lash stood over him, breathing easy, not even winded, and extended a hand out of old habit, the reflex of a warrior who respects a man enough to help him up even after knocking him down. Luke did not take it right away. He lay in the dust for a moment, looking up at her outlined against the pale mountain sky, and he laughed, not bitterly, not mockingly, just a soft, surprised sound, as though he had discovered something funny about the whole shape of the morning. "You could have hit me a great deal harder than that," he said. "I could have broken your jaw," she agreed. "Why didn't you?" She hesitated. It was such a small hesitation that most of the crowd would not have noticed it at all, but Luke did, lying there in the dust looking up at her, and something told him that hesitation mattered. "I have not decided yet," she admitted, "whether you are worth breaking." He took her offered hand then, and let her haul him up onto his feet with an ease that made his boots skid in the dirt, and once he was standing, he did not let go of her hand right away. Instead, still slightly breathless, still dust-streaked, he lifted it, and with the crowd watching, with Fitch's jaw dropping open, with Captain Dunmore's arms falling loose at his sides in astonishment, he bent his head and pressed his lips lightly to her knuckles, the way a man might greet a lady at a formal hall, except her knuckles were still wrapped in fighting leather and faintly smeared with the dust of 8 fallen soldiers. "Then I yield," Luke said, straightening, meeting her eyes without flinching, gladly and without shame, "because I would rather lose to the finest fighter I have ever seen than win against a lesser one. My thanks for the lesson, Lash Grimtusk." He did not know her name. He had heard it shouted somewhere in the crowd, tossed around like a curse or a warning, and he simply used it easily, the way you would use anyone's name, without the fear or reverence the rest of the fort seemed to load into it. For one full breath, Lash Grimtusk, who had walked unafraid into a fortress of the people who had once burned her clan's winter camps, who had broken 8 soldiers without drawing her blade, who had not blushed at anything since she was a tusked girl of 13 summers being teased by her older cousins, felt heat rise up her throat and into her face. A warm, helpless flush spreading beneath her green-gray skin, visible to anyone close enough to see it. And there were a great many people close enough to see it. The yard went utterly silent. Then one of the abbey monks, of all people, let out a startled laugh, and the whole crowd seemed to exhale at once, breaking into a buzz of astonished chatter. "She's blushing," Fitch said, in the tone of a man who could not quite believe his own eyes. "The orc woman is blushing." Lash rounded on him with a snarl that sent him stumbling back 2 full steps, but the damage, if it could be called that, was already done. She turned back to Luke, opened her mouth to say something scathing, something to reclaim the ground she felt slipping strangely beneath her feet, and found that, for the first time in longer than she could remember, she had absolutely nothing to say. "You may go and tend your mule, lighthouse man," she finally managed, with as much dignity as she could gather, "before I decide to break your jaw after all." "Yes, ma'am," Luke said, and there was a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth as he walked away to retrieve the mule, and he did not look back to see whether she watched him go. She watched him go. That evening, in the long common hall of what had once been the abbey's refectory, Luke sat near the hearth eating a bowl of fish stew and trying very hard to look like a man who was not still thinking about the way an orc warrior's face had gone soft and pink in front of half the garrison. He did not entirely succeed. Old Brother Ansel, one of the few monks who still lived in the fort and tended the chapel bell, had already teased him twice about it, and Luke had twice pretended not to hear. The third time he looked up, it was not Brother Ansel standing over his table but Lash herself, a wooden bowl of stew in her own hands, looking down at him with an expression that dared him to say anything about the morning at all. "May I sit?" she said. It was not really a question. "Please," Luke said, and moved his cloak off the bench beside him. She sat, and the bench groaned under the shift of weight, and for a moment neither of them said anything, the fire cracking and the murmur of the hall going on around them, soldiers throwing curious, wary glances toward their table and then quickly away again. "You are not what I expected of this fort," Lash said finally. "I don't live in the fort," Luke said. "I keep the light on the headland below the cliffs. I only come up twice a month for trade and to report on ships." "A man alone on a rock in the sea," she said, tasting the idea. "That does not sound like much of a life." "It suits me," Luke said. "The sea doesn't ask anything of a man he can't give. It doesn't care what you look like or where you come from. It just wants the light kept burning so ships don't break themselves on the rocks in the dark. There's a kind of peace in that." Lash studied him for a long moment, her spoon forgotten in her bowl. "I have walked into 3 human towns since I left my clan's camp," she said slowly, "and in every one of them, the moment they saw what I was, they reached for a blade or ran or spat at my feet. You looked at me in that yard as though I were simply a woman who had beaten some soldiers in a fight." "You are simply a woman who beat some soldiers in a fight," Luke said. "A very good one. I don't see why that should frighten anyone." "You should be frightened," Lash said, and there was something dark and tired beneath the words now, something that had nothing to do with the fight and everything to do with whatever had brought her, alone, unescorted, to a human fort in the first place. "You have no idea what I am capable of, Luke Walker." It was the first time she had used his full name. He noticed. He filed it away somewhere close to his heart without quite realizing he had done it. "Maybe not," he agreed. "But I know what you did today. 8 men, and not one of them bleeding worse than a bruise. A woman who wanted to hurt people would have drawn that blade at least once." He nodded at the curved sword still resting against her hip. "You weren't looking to hurt anyone. You were looking for something else. Someone who wouldn't run." Lash's jaw tightened. For a moment he thought she might simply get up and walk away, and he braced himself for it, disappointed already at the thought of losing this strange, sharp-edged conversation before it had properly begun. Instead, she said, very quietly, so quietly that the words barely carried over the crackle of the hearth, "I am looking for someone I can trust with something that could burn this whole coast to the ground if it falls into the wrong hands. I have not yet decided if that someone exists." Luke set down his spoon. "Then I hope you find them," he said. "And I hope, whoever they are, they're worth the search." She looked at him for a long moment, and something in her amber eyes was searching his face the way a woman searches a coastline for a safe harbor in the middle of a storm, uncertain whether the light she sees is real or only a trick of the waves. "So do I," she murmured, and said nothing more that night. Over the next 2 weeks, Fort Aldermore learned to live with the presence of an orc woman, inside its walls the way a body learns to live with a splinter it has decided not to dig out, with wariness, with the occasional flare of pain, but without daring to remove the thing that had lodged itself so deep. Captain Dunmore, after a long and uncomfortable conversation in his quarters, had agreed to let Lash stay as a guest under his personal watch, in exchange for information about troop movements along the old clan borders that she claimed, truthfully but not fully, to possess. She slept in the old scriptorium, now used as an armory storeroom, and she trained in the yard each morning, and men still lined up out of pride or foolishness to test themselves against her, and she still put every one of them in the dust. But it was the lighthouse man she sought out, again and again, on the days he came up the mountain road. "Race me," she said one morning, catching his mule's lead rope before he had even finished tying it to the post outside the trading post. "Up the north stair to the bell tower. Whoever rings the abbey bell first wins." "Wins what?" Luke asked, amused despite himself. "The satisfaction of knowing you tried," Lash said, already moving toward the stone stair that spiraled up the old abbey tower, which, given your history of losing fights, should be a familiar feeling. "He lost that race too, of course he did. Her legs were longer and her lungs deeper, and she took the stairs 2 at a time with the tireless ease of a mountain goat. But he lost it laughing, gasping for breath at the top of the tower with his hands braced on his knees while she rang the bell in triumph. And when he looked up at her standing against the wide blue sky with the wind pulling strands loose from her braid, he thought, with a kind of quiet, startled certainty, that he had never in his life seen anything so alive. "You are smiling," Lash observed, coming to stand beside him at the tower's edge, looking out over the fort's walls to the silver ribbon of the coast far below, where he could just make out the white stone finger of his lighthouse rising from the rocky headland. "I generally do after losing to you," Luke said. "It seems to be becoming something of a habit." "You should learn to win occasionally," she said, though there was no real reproach in it. "Maybe I don't want to," Luke said. And then, because the wind and the height and the sight of her laughing at the top of a bell tower had loosened something in his chest that had been tightly wound for a very long time, he added quieter, "Maybe I like exactly where losing to you has got me." She turned to look at him then, and the teasing light in her eyes shifted into something else, something that made the air between them feel suddenly very thin and very charged, the way it does in the last breathless moment before a storm breaks. "You are a strange man, Luke Walker," she said softly. "So I've been told," he said, "mostly by people who thought it was an insult." "I do not think it is an insult," Lash said, and reached out, slowly, deliberately, and brushed a thumb along his jaw where a fresh bruise from that morning's practice bout with Fitch had begun to bloom. Fitch, who had not learned his lesson at all and kept challenging Luke to spar out of spite, and kept losing worse than Luke did, because at least Luke's losses came with a kind of grace Fitch could never manage. This should not have happened. "I told the sergeant if he touched you again I would break more than his pride." "It's only a bruise," Luke said, very aware of the warmth of her hand against his skin, aware of how still she had gone, aware that neither of them had moved away. "It is more than that," Lash said. "It is a man being punished by fools for standing near me. I have seen it before. I know how these things end in human towns. I did not want it to end that way here." "It won't," Luke said. "I'm not going anywhere, Lash." She searched his face for a long moment as if testing the weight of that promise, and then, abruptly, she let her hand drop and stepped back, putting distance between them with a suddenness that felt almost like retreat. "I have duties," she said, though her voice had lost some of its usual iron. The captain wants a report on the coastal trails before dusk." "Of course," Luke said, and did not push, though something in him ached at the sudden withdrawal, and he wondered, walking back down the spiral stair alone, what exactly it was that made a woman who feared nothing suddenly afraid of standing too close to him at the top of a tower. He did not have to wonder for long. That very night, the fear that lived behind Lash Grimtusk's amber eyes came walking up the mountain road in the shape of 3 riders in dark leathers, and it very nearly cost them both everything. Luke had stayed the night at the fort, sleeping in the stable loft as he sometimes did rather than walk the cliff path down to the lighthouse in the dark, and he woke to the sound of the alarm bell, not the deep, steady bell that Lash had rung in triumph 2 weeks before, but a frantic, clattering peal that brought soldiers stumbling out of the barracks with swords half drawn and torches flaring against the black mountain night. He came out into the yard to find chaos. 3 riders had approached the gate under cover of darkness, and when the watch had challenged them, one had loosed an arrow that struck a torch bracket and sent burning oil spilling across the gatehouse steps. In the confusion and the firelight, Luke saw them, Orc riders, lean and hard-faced, wearing black leather marked with a crude brand of crossed tusks burned into the shoulder, and at their head, a scarred warrior on a huge dun horse who was shouting something in the old Orc tongue that made Lash go rigid as stone beside the well where she had been drawing water. "Korath's riders," she breathed. "He found me." "Who is Korath?" Luke demanded, but there was no time for an answer, because the lead rider had already spotted her across the yard and wheeled his horse toward her with a spear leveled low, and the fort's soldiers, confused and half-blinded by smoke, were too slow to close the gap. Luke did not think. He simply moved, throwing himself into the space between the charging horse and the woman standing frozen by the well, seizing a fallen soldier's shield from the ground and raising it just as the spearpoint drove forward. The impact rang up his arm like a thunderclap and knocked him flat onto his back in the mud. The shield's rim cracked clean through, but the spear had not found its mark, and that single, desperate act of interposing his own body bought Lash the half-second she needed to draw her blade at last. She moved like something out of an old war song, blade flashing silver in the torchlight, and the rider's spear was in 2 pieces on the ground, and the rider himself was on his back gasping before Luke had even managed to sit up. The other 2 riders, seeing their leader down and the fort's soldiers finally rallying with drawn steel and leveled crossbows, wheeled their mounts and fled back down the mountain road into the dark, leaving the fallen man behind. Lash knelt over the downed rider, her blade at his throat, and spoke to him in low, harsh words that Luke did not understand, though the fear in the man's eyes needed no translation. Whatever answer she got, it made her face go pale beneath the green, and she rose, sheathing her blade, and turned to find Luke being helped up off the ground by 2 startled soldiers, mud-streaked, one arm hanging awkwardly where the shield's recoil had wrenched his shoulder, but alive, and looking at her with nothing but relief in his eyes. She crossed the yard to him in 3 strides, and before the entire gathered garrison, before Captain Dunmore and Sergeant Fitch and every soldier who had ever doubted either of them, she pulled Luke Walker into her arms and held him there, her face buried against his shoulder, shaking not with fear for herself, but with the terror of what she had almost lost. "You fool," she whispered fiercely into his ear where only he could hear it. "You reckless, ridiculous man, you could have died." "So could you," Luke said, wincing at his shoulder but not pulling away from her, not for anything. "Seemed only fair I take the risk too." "That is not how it is supposed to work," Lash said, drawing back just enough to look at him, her eyes bright and fierce. "I am the one who is supposed to be too strong to need protecting." "Everyone needs someone at their back sometimes," Luke said quietly. "Even you, Lash Grimtusk. Especially you, maybe, if that man tonight is any sign of what's hunting you." She did not answer that. Not there. Not with half the fort watching and the captured rider groaning in the mud and Sergeant Fitch staring at the 2 of them with an expression somewhere between disgust and grudging astonishment. But later, much later, after the rider had been dragged off to a cell and the fires put out and the yard finally gone quiet under the cold stars, she came to find him where he sat outside the stable with his shoulder bound in a sling, and she sat beside him without asking permission this time, close enough that her arm pressed warm against his. "I owe you the truth," she said into the darkness. "All of it. Tonight proved I cannot keep carrying it alone, and I do not want any more. Not from you." "I'm listening," Luke said. And so, beneath a sky thick with stars, with the captured rider's fate still undecided, and the smell of smoke still hanging in the cold mountain air, Lash Grimtusk told him everything. "My father was Kesek Grimtusk," she said, "chieftain of the Grimtusk clan, and one of the 3 chiefs who signed the Ashgill Accord after the war, the treaty that has kept an uneasy peace between your people and mine for 11 years. I was raised believing that peace, however bitter it tasted to some of our elders, was the only path that did not end with our children burying their children. My father believed it until the day he died." "Died how?" Luke asked, though something in her voice already told him the answer would not be gentle. "Korath Skarn," she said, "the man whose rider lies in your fort's cells tonight was my father's second, sworn to him, trusted by him. Korath believes the treaty was a surrender dressed up as peace. He has spent years gathering warriors who agree with him, quietly, in the deep camps beyond the ridge line where no human patrol goes. 3 months ago, he poisoned my father's wine at a clan gathering and named it a human assassin's work, to stir the old hatred back to life. I was the only one who saw him do it. I was the only one who knew the truth." Luke's breath caught. "Why didn't you tell your people?" "I tried," Lash said, and her voice, for the first time since he had known her, cracked with something raw and old. "I told the elders what I saw. Korath called me a liar, said I sought to shame my father's memory to protect myself, and enough warriors already hungry for war believed him over a grieving daughter. He had me branded an oath-breaker before the whole camp, a traitor's mark, burned into my own flesh by my own kin, and gave me one night to run before he would have had me killed to silence me for good." She pulled back the leather bracer on her left forearm, and in the starlight Luke saw it for the first time, a raised, ugly scar in the shape of a broken tusk, burned deep into the green-gray skin, still healing at its edges. "That's the mark," she said quietly. "A branded outlaw. That is what I am to my own people now. Korath has already sent word through the deep camps that he intends to break the accord within the month, to strike the border towns before your baron even knows there is a threat, and call it vengeance for a murder that never happened. If he succeeds, this war will not end in 11 years. It will end when one people or the other no longer exists to fight it." Luke stared at the brand on her arm, at the woman beside him who carried the fate of an entire coastline in her exile, alone, hunted by her own kin, mistrusted by his, and he felt something in his chest twist with a fierce, protective ache he had never felt for anyone in his life. "That's why you came here," he said. "Not to fight the men of this fort for sport. You needed to prove you were strong enough, worthy enough, that someone would actually listen when you told them what you know." "Yes," Lash said, "and every man I beat in that yard only proved to me that strength alone was not enough. Strength did not make Dunmore trust me. It did not make the soldiers stop flinching when I passed. I did not know what would, until a man who had never won a fight in his life stood up in front of everyone and refused to be afraid of me." She turned to face him fully now, and in the starlight her eyes were bright and unguarded in a way he had never seen them. "You made me feel something in that yard I have not felt since I was a girl too young to know what it meant. And every day since, standing near you, watching you smile after every loss, watching you leap in front of a spear tonight without a single moment's hesitation, I have felt it grow into something I do not know how to carry any better than I carry that brand." "Tell me anyway," Luke said, his voice low and unsteady. "Whatever it is, I want to know." "I think," Lash said softly, that I have fallen in love with you, Luke Walker, and it terrifies me far more than any blade Korath's riders could put through my heart, because a blade I know how to fight. This I do not." The words hung in the cold air between them, fragile and enormous, and Luke felt his own heart slam against his ribs so hard he was sure she must be able to hear it. "I don't think you need to fight it," he said. "I think you just need to let it in. The way I let you in, the moment you knocked me flat on my back in that yard and I looked up and thought, whatever happens next, I want to know this woman for the rest of my life." Lash made a sound that was half a laugh and half something far more fragile, and then she reached out and cupped his face in both her hands, careful of his bandaged shoulder, and kissed him, fierce and hungry and trembling all at once. The kiss of a woman who had spent weeks holding herself back from something she wanted more than she had ever wanted anything, finally letting go. Luke kissed her back with everything he had, his good arm sliding around her waist to pull her closer, and when they finally broke apart, both of them breathless, foreheads pressed together beneath the wide, dark sky, she whispered against his mouth, "I have never wanted anyone the way I want you. I did not think a human man could ever make me feel this. I was wrong, and I have never been so glad to be wrong in my life." "Then don't fight it anymore," Luke murmured. "Let me stand beside you. Whatever comes next with Korath, with the Accord, with all of it, you don't have to carry it alone." "No," Lash agreed, threading her fingers through his hair, holding him as though she meant never to let go again. "Not anymore." They stayed like that a long while, wrapped together in the cold and the quiet, and for the first time since her father's murder, Lash Grimtusk allowed herself to simply feel safe. But safety, in a fort perched above a coastline balanced on the edge of war, never lasted long. The captured rider gave up Korath's plans under questioning 3 days later. The raid was to fall upon the border town of Millhaven within a fortnight, timed to look like a rogue clan attack, with Korath's warriors then answering the human retaliation with overwhelming force, dragging every clan on the ridge into war whether they wished it or not. Captain Dunmore, to his credit, believed enough of it to send riders to warn Millhaven and to petition Baron Aldrich Vane, the regional lord, for reinforcements. But belief and proof were different things, and Dunmore's own soldiers were divided. It was Sergeant Fitch, still smarting from his defeat in the yard and jealous in some ugly, small way of the warmth that had grown between Luke and Lash, who did the damage. He had seen the brand on her arm the night of the raid, when her bracer had slipped in the chaos, and rather than bring it to the captain quietly, he chose the worst possible moment to reveal it, the very afternoon that Baron Vane himself arrived at Fort Aldermore with a company of mounted knights to assess the threat in person. The Baron's arrival brought half the fort out into the yard, knights in polished mail, banners snapping in the mountain wind, townsfolk from the trading post below crowding the gate to catch a glimpse of nobility. Lash stood near the well with Luke, having just returned from another border patrol, when Fitch shoved through the crowd and seized her wrist, wrenching the bracer aside before she could stop him. "Look!" he shouted, loud enough to carry across the whole yard, loud enough to still every conversation at once. "Look what she's hidden from all of you. A branded traitor, marked outlaw by her own people, and Captain Dunmore has let her walk free among us for weeks." The crowd's reaction was immediate and ugly. Gasps, then shouts, then the metallic hiss of blades clearing sheaths as soldiers who had spent weeks growing uneasily accustomed to Lash's presence suddenly remembered every old fear they had buried to allow it. Baron Vane himself, a stern gray-bearded man in a fur-lined cloak, stepped down from his horse with his hand on his sword hilt, staring at the brand on Lash's forearm with open suspicion. "An oath-breaker," he said, "walking free inside a fort of the crown, and no one thought to inform me." "My lord, I can explain," Dunmore began, but the Baron was already turning to his knights. "Seize her," he said. "If her own kind branded her a traitor, I will not have her poisoning this garrison with whatever lies bought her a captain's trust. She hangs for this deception, or she rots in irons until her own people come to collect her." 2 knights moved forward, and Lash, who could have broken every man in that yard without drawing her blade, did not resist, not because she could not fight her way free, but because Luke could see, in the sudden stillness of her face, that she had simply run out of strength to keep proving herself to people determined to see only the mark and never the woman beneath it. She let them seize her wrists. She let them force her to her knees in the dust of the very yard where she had once stood laughing at the top of a bell tower with the wind in her hair. Luke Walker had never in his life raised his voice to a nobleman, had never stood against armed knights, had never done anything in that fort that anyone would call brave in the way songs describe bravery. But he stepped forward now, into the space between Lash and the Baron's drawn sword, exactly as he had once stepped between her and a charging spear, and this time his voice did not shake at all. "My lord, before you hang the only person on this mountain who can stop a war, I think you had better hear why she was branded in the first place." "Stand aside, lighthouse keeper," Baron Vane said coldly. "This is no business of yours." "It's every business of mine," Luke said, "because I love her, and because what she's carrying is proof that could save every soul in Millhaven and every fort along this coast, and if you hang her for it, you will be doing exactly what the man who framed her murder wants." That got the Baron's attention. Luke pressed on before anyone could stop him, laying out everything Lash had told him beneath the stars Korath Skarn, the poisoned wine, the false accusation, the planned false flag raid on Millhaven meant to reignite the whole war. He had no proof beyond his own word and hers, but he spoke with such steady, unflinching conviction that the yard, which moments before had been baying for a hanging, fell instead into an uneasy, listening silence. "She could have run the moment she crossed your border," Luke said. "She could have hidden that brand and told you nothing, and let this whole coast burn while she saved her own skin somewhere far from here. Instead, she walked into a fort full of people who hate what she is, and she fought every man inside your walls, and she waited, and she trusted, because she needed someone strong enough to believe her before it was too late. I am asking you to be that someone, my lord, not for her sake, for every family in Millhaven who has no idea what's coming for them." The captured rider, brought forward at Dunmore's urging and questioned again in front of the Baron himself, corroborated enough of it, the timing, the plan, Korath's name, that Vane's cold certainty finally cracked into something more cautious. He looked down at Lash, still kneeling in the dust with Luke standing between her and his drawn sword, and something in his stern face shifted. "An Oathbreaker's brand," he said slowly, "or the mark of the only orc on this mountain honest enough to name a murderer to his face and pay the price for it." He sheathed his sword. "Release her." The knights let go of Lash's wrists. She rose slowly, rubbing at the red marks left by their grip, and looked at Luke with an expression that held equal parts disbelief and a fierce, overwhelming gratitude. "You stood against a baron's blade for me," she said quietly, once the yard had begun to disperse into 100 whispered conversations, with nothing but your own word. "It was the truth," Luke said, as if that were the simplest thing in the world. "The truth doesn't need a blade behind it to be worth standing for. Every person in this fort was ready to see me hanged," Lash said. "You were the only one who saw past the brand." "I've always seen past it," Luke said, "from the very first day. I only ever saw you." She kissed him then, right there in the yard, in front of the Baron and the knights and Captain Dunmore, and every soldier she had once thrown into the dust, and no one in Fort Aldermore dared say a single word against it. But there was no time to linger in that moment, however sweet it was, because Baron Vane, once convinced, moved quickly. Riders were sent to Millhaven with warning. Dunmore's garrison was put on full alert. And Lash, given at last a chance to speak with the weight of official belief behind her, told the Baron the one thing that could end this before it began entirely. Korath Skarn, for all his warriors and his cunning, could still be challenged for the right to lead under the old clan law, if a rival of proven blood stood forward before the ridge camps and named him murderer and oathbreaker in front of witnesses. It was a right that belonged to her, as Kesek Grimtusk's daughter, a formal challenge, blade against blade, chief against chief, that Koreth could not refuse without losing the loyalty of every warrior who still respected the old ways more than his ambition. "If I win," Lash said, standing in Dunmore's map room with Luke at her side and the Baron across the table, "his claim dies with him and there is no war because there will be no one left to want one badly enough to start it. If I lose—" "You will not lose," Luke said before she could finish the thought, and there was no doubt at all in his voice. "You cannot know that," Lash said softly. "No," Luke agreed. "But I know you, and I am not letting you ride to that ridge alone." "It is a challenge between orcs under orc law," Lash said. "You cannot stand in that circle with me, Luke. It would not be permitted, and even if it were, Koreth's warriors would cut you down before you took 2 steps. "Then I'll stand at the edge of it," Luke said. "Close enough that you know I'm there. That's all I'm asking." She could not argue him out of it, and in truth, watching the quiet, stubborn set of his jaw, she found she did not want to. They rode out 3 days later, Lash on a borrowed warhorse, Luke beside her on his mule because it was the only mount he owned, and he refused to be left behind over something so small as that. With a small escort of Dunmore's soldiers and 2 of the Baron's knights trailing a cautious distance behind, enough to bear witness, but not enough to look like an invasion. The road wound down from Fort Aldermore's mountainside, through pine forest gone gold and red with the turning season, toward the high ridge camps where Koreth Skarn had gathered his warriors under the old cross-tusk banner of rebellion. The ridge camp, when they reached it at dusk on the 2nd day, was a sprawl of hide tents and cook fires spread across a wide shoulder of mountain, smoke rising into a sky bruised purple and orange with the last of the sunset. Hundreds of orc warriors turned to watch as Lash rode into the firelight, her back straight, her chin high, the brand on her forearm bared deliberately for all to see, and beside her, remarkably, unmistakably, a human man on a mule, refusing to fall back even as spears turned to point at his chest. Koreth Skarn came out of the largest tent to meet them, tall and scarred, his own tusks filed to cruel points, and when he saw Lash he laughed, a short, ugly sound. "The Oathbreaker returns," he called out, loud enough for the whole camp to hear, with a human pet trailing at her heels. "Have you come to beg forgiveness, Grimtusk, or simply to die where your father died?" "I have come to name you what you are," Lash said, dismounting, her voice carrying clear and hard across the firelit camp, "in front of every warrior who once called my father chief. Koreth Skarn poisoned Kesek Grimtusk's wine at the autumn gathering and blamed it on human assassins to buy himself a war he could rule. I saw him do it. I have carried the truth of it through exile and a hunter's brand ever since, and I name him murderer, oathbreaker, and unfit to lead, and I challenge his claim under the old law, blade for blade, before every witness gathered here." A murmur swept the camp like wind through dry grass. Koreth's face darkened. "Lies," he spat. "The same lies she told the elders before I had her marked and cast out." "Then let the blade decide what words cannot," Lash said, drawing her sword. "The way our people have always let it decide, before you dressed up ambition as vengeance and called it honor." Koreth could not refuse without shaming himself before his own warriors. The old law was older than his rebellion, and every eye in that camp was on him now, weighing whether he was truly the leader he claimed to be or merely a man who had murdered his way into a stolen title. He drew his own blade, twice the size of hers, and the crowd drew back to form a wide, fire-lit circle, the same shape as the training yard where all of this had begun, except now the stakes were not pride but the fate of an entire coastline. Luke stood at the very edge of that circle, exactly where he had promised to be, his heart hammering so hard he thought it might crack his ribs, watching the woman he loved face a warrior twice her size with nothing but a blade and the truth on her side. The fight was brutal and fast, nothing like the training yard bouts that had first brought them together. Koreth fought with brute strength and old fury, driving Lash back with blows that shattered the air. But Lash fought with something he did not have: the clean, cold clarity of a warrior fighting not for pride or ambition, but for the memory of her father and the lives of every family in Millhaven who had no idea a stranger's blade was all that stood between them and a war they never asked for. She ducked beneath a wild overhand strike, drove her shoulder into his ribs, and when he staggered, she brought the flat of her blade cracking across the back of his knees and put him on the ground the way she had once put 8 soldiers on the ground in a fort's training yard, without needing to spill blood to prove her point. She stood over him, blade at his throat, breathing hard, and the entire camp held its breath. "Yield," she said, "and answer for my father's murder before the elders' council, or die here and now for your treason. Either way, your claim to lead this camp ends tonight." Korath, staring up the length of her blade with the firelight glinting off the edge, made his choice, the coward's choice, the only one left to a man whose ambition had always outpaced his courage. He yielded, and the warriors who had followed him, seeing their leader broken and disgraced before them, lowered their own weapons one by one, until the circle was full of Orc warriors kneeling not to Korath, but to the woman who had exposed him. It was done. The rebellion that might have plunged the whole Ashkill coast into a second war died there on that fire-lit ridge, not with a massacre, but with a single fight fairly won, and a truth finally believed. Luke crossed the circle the moment it was over, ignoring the wary glances of Orc warriors who had never seen a human walk so freely among them, and Lash turned from Korath's disgraced, kneeling form to meet him halfway, blade still in her hand. Blood and firelight streaked across her face, and she looked more beautiful to him in that moment than she had ever looked, more alive, more herself. "You did it," Luke said, cupping her face in his hands, heedless of the blood. "You actually did it." "We did it," Lash corrected him, breathless, letting her sword fall to hang loose at her side so she could pull him into her arms instead. "I could not have stood in that circle with the strength I needed if you had not stood at its edge believing I would win before I had even drawn my blade. You gave me that, Luke. You have given me that every single day since the moment you looked up at me from the dust and laughed instead of flinching." The Elders' Council, summoned within the week, confirmed Korath's guilt from his own broken confession and stripped him of every rank and claim among the clans. Lash Grimtusk's brand, by ancient law, was declared unjustly given, and the elders themselves performed the old rite of striking it from her name before the whole gathered council, not erasing the scar from her skin. For some wounds do not heal that easily, but declaring before witnesses that the mark carried no shame, that the woman who bore it had been the truest daughter her father ever had, and that any clan who called her outlaw again would answer to the council itself. The Ashkill Accord held. Millhaven never learned how close it had come to burning. Baron Vane, chastened by how nearly his own suspicion had cost the coast its peace, sent formal thanks and a small chest of silver to Fort Aldermore for the role its garrison had played, though everyone who had stood in that yard the day the truth came out knew perfectly well whose courage had actually turned the tide. Fort Aldermore threw a celebration the night Lash and Luke returned from the ridge camp, torches blazing along the walls, tables dragged out into the yard groaning under roasted meat and mountain wine, soldiers who had once flinched from Lash's shadow now raising cups in her honor, Sergeant Fitch himself grudgingly offering a hand that Lash, with more grace than he deserved, actually shook. Captain Dunmore made a speech that was too long and too formal, and made half the yard laugh affectionately at him for it. Brother Ansel rang the abbey bell long past midnight, just because he could, just because, for the first time in 11 years, the sound felt like celebration instead of warning. It was well past that midnight bell, the fires burning low, most of the fort finally stumbling off to sleep, that Lash found Luke sitting alone on the low wall overlooking the coast, the silver thread of the sea and the small white finger of his lighthouse just visible far below in the moonlight, exactly where she had first learned he called home. "You are thinking," she said, settling onto the wall beside him, "about the lighthouse." "I am," Luke admitted. It's been dark down there for a week now. Someone will need to relight it soon, or ships along this coast will start running blind. And will that someone be you? Lash asked, though there was no real question in it, only a kind of gentle testing of what came next, now that the war had been stopped and the world had gone quiet enough to finally ask what they wanted from it. Luke turned to look at her, moonlight silvering the curve of her tusks, the fading bruise along her jaw from Koreth's blade, the brand on her forearm that the elders had declared no shame at all. He thought of the years he had spent alone on that headland, keeping a light burning for ships he never met, content in a solitude he had told himself was peace, but had, in truth, simply been the shape of a life waiting to be interrupted. "I've spent 8 years telling myself the sea was enough company for a man like me," he said slowly, "that the light didn't care who I was, and that was worth something. But I don't think I want to go back to keeping it alone, Lash. Not now. Not after you." "Then don't," Lash said simply. "There is nothing binding me to a clan that branded me for telling the truth, or to a fort that only trusted me once a human man was foolish enough to stand between me and a barren sword. I have no home left to return to, Luke Walker, except the one I choose, and I choose you. Wherever that light is kept, I want to keep it beside you." "It's a hard life," Luke warned, though he was already smiling, already feeling something loosen and lift in his chest at the plain, fierce certainty in her voice. "Storms, isolation, months where the only company is the sound of the sea against the rocks. I have spent my whole life among warriors who feared what I might become, and a father who was murdered for wanting peace," Lash said. "A hard life beside someone who loves me honestly sounds like the easiest thing I have ever been offered." Word was sent down to the coastal authority that the lighthouse keeper had taken a companion, and no formal objection came, because Luke Walker had, in the space of a single season, become something of a quiet legend along that stretch of the Ashgill coast. The man who stood between an orc woman and a baron's blade and turned out, against every expectation, to be right. Captain Dunmore arranged for a young soldier's widow with a head for practical work to take over the trading post's oil ledger so Luke's supply runs would not fall to chance. And within a fortnight, Lash Grimtusk and Luke Walker rode down the mountain road together toward the headland, her borrowed warhorse traded for one of her own, his mule laden not with oil casks alone, but with the few belongings she had gathered in her exile, a spare set of leathers, a worn clan token that had once belonged to her father, the curved sword that had ended Koreth's ambitions on a firelit ridge. They stood together that first evening at the base of the lighthouse, the tall white tower rising above them against a sky streaked gold and violet with sunset, waves breaking white against the black rocks below, gulls wheeling overhead in the last light. Lash tilted her head back to look up at the tower's full height, and something in her face, so often set in the hard lines of a warrior's guard, softened into open wonder. "This is truly your home," she said. "Our home," Luke corrected her gently, "if you'll have it. I have fought 8 men in a training yard, a baron's knights, and a murderer twice my size for the right to choose my own life," Lash said, turning to him with a fierce, brilliant smile that held nothing back at all. "I do not intend to hesitate now, over the easiest choice I have ever made." She reached for his hand, twining her fingers through his, the brand on her forearm catching the last of the sunset light like something reclaimed rather than something shameful. "Take me up your tower, Luke Walker, and show me this light you have spent your whole life keeping burning for strangers. I would very much like to help you keep it burning for us instead." They climbed the spiral stairs together as the sun sank fully into the sea, and at the top, in the small glass-walled chamber where the great lamp waited to be lit, Luke struck the flint and coaxed the flame to life, and its beam swept out across the darkening water, steady and bright, the same light that had guided 100 ships safely home over the years, now witness to something new beginning in its glow. Lash wrapped her arms around him from behind as the light turned slowly above them, resting her chin against his shoulder, watching the beam sweep the dark water where storms would surely come again, as storms always did on that wild coast. But where? For the first time in longer than either of them could remember, neither one of them would face the coming weather alone. I once told a fort full of frightened men that I was searching for someone worth trusting with everything I carried, she murmured against his ear. I did not expect to find him losing a fight in a cloud of dust, laughing at his own failure as though it were the funniest thing in the world. I did not expect to find the rest of my life, Luke said, turning in her arms to face her, the lighthouse beam sweeping gold and white across both their faces in slow, steady rhythm. In the woman who beat me so thoroughly I forgot to be embarrassed about it. Good, Lash said, and kissed him there at the top of the tower, with the light turning above them and the whole wide, restless sea spread out below, because I have no intention of ever letting you go. They stayed at the lighthouse through that winter, and when the spring thaw opened the mountain roads again, they did not stay put for long. The Baron, grateful and more than a little in awe of what the two of them had accomplished together, had a use for a pair who could move easily between human towns and orc camps alike, who were trusted on both sides of a peace that had nearly broken, and had instead been mended stronger than before, carrying word between the ridge camps and the border forts, smoothing old fears before they could curdle into new wars. Riding the coastal roads and the mountain passes together with no fort walls to hold them, and no lighthouse tower to keep them tethered in one place for long. They found in the end that neither of them had ever truly wanted stillness, not Luke, who had spent 8 lonely years telling himself the sea was company enough, and not Lash, who had spent her exile searching restlessly for a home that turned out not to be a place at all, but a person. So they left the lighthouse in the care of the widow's grown son, who took to the work with a steady hand, and they rode out together down the winding coast road as the spring light broke gold over the mountains, her borrowed warhorse long since become her own, his mule traded for a horse of his own worth the journey ahead, the whole wide unclaimed world stretching out before them in every direction they might choose to go. Where to first? Luke asked, as the fort's walls fell away behind them and the road curved south along the cliffs toward horizons neither of them had ever seen. Wherever the road takes us, Lash said, reaching over to take his hand as their horses fell into an easy pace side by side, so long as it takes us there together. And so they rode on into a morning bright with new sun, two proud equals who had once tested each other in a fort's dusty yard and found, beneath all that fire and rivalry, a love neither of them had ever expected and neither of them would ever again let go.